Now, in this journey of trying to unite these two great mysteries, do you resist the temptation to fall into the two mysteries argument, which says, well, quantum's a mystery, consciousness is a mystery, so perhaps they're connected? Or do you think that there's enough reason to believe they are connected?
I fall into the camp of, well, let's just try and rule it out. So, you've got these two kind of jigsaw puzzle shaped pieces that seem to fit together. And I think people have this objection to, well, it can't be that simple, but maybe it is. So you've got these two mysteries. They do seem linked to one another in multiple ways. Maybe we should just go with the hypothesis that they're related and try and test that first scientifically. And then we're all scientists here. Our bread and butter is being wrong and then trying again if we're wrong. I just don't think there's anything wrong with making that your hypothesis that, yes, they are linked. Let's try and find evidence for it. And then if you don't find any evidence, maybe they're not.
Give us a couple of examples of how they could be thought of as linked.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's evidence from the very early days of quantum mechanics where if you kind of read back some of the greats, they all talked about observer effects. Like, does the observer have a role in what's going on here? Does human consciousness even have a role? Erwin Schrödinger talked about this, and he wrote a whole book called What is Life that kind of suggested there was some interesting interplay between quantum mechanics and life. And so a lot of the early pioneers thought about this, but then it kind of, guess maybe through the years of the war and then afterwards, it's sort of all that intrigue and mystery kind of just got disappeared. And it's probably because I have a theory on this. I think it's because physics departments had to start teaching quantum mechanics. And you can't teach a subject if it's completely buried in philosophy and mystery, and we don't know this and that, and how is it related to consciousness? It becomes really interdisciplinary. And I just don't think physics departments were sort of ready to teach all that. They had to kind of bring it back down to something that fitted in line with regular physics. So then there's this the Feynman kind of stuff where it's shut up and calculate. Like, we've got these equations. They seem to be very predictive. Let's just teach. There are these equations. They predict this, and we'll sweep away all that other.
But Suzanne, you're not speaking about the famous possibility that consciousness is responsible for collapsing the wave function. I think it was Wigman von Neumann had a paper about that famously, which wasn't really taken seriously at the time. That was in the 70s, wasn't it? And then I think David Chalmers and one of his collaborators actually tried to test it recently, and David Chalmers told me that they didn't get any results. Do you think that it is possible that consciousness is collapsing the wave function, or do you think that that's been set aside by now?
I think it is. Yes, but I think it's doing it in a way that's people don't normally think about consciousness. So when people think about consciousness, they're bringing in all these assumptions and baggage that consciousness is like a human, a person, an observer, a scientist is the thing that's conscious, looking at a quantum system and collapsing it. I don't believe that. I believe that because I'm what you might call a panpsychist, I think everything has consciousness in it, right down to the most fundamental level. So if you have, say, two electrons and they interact with each other, you could make an argument that one consciousness is now interacting with another, and there's some measurement process going on there, which could collapse the wave function, if you like. So my definition of consciousness is much, or an observer is much broader than most people coming into this that just have this narrow defined view of, oh, it's like a scientist looking at an instrument. It's not like that. It's like all the little parts inside the instrument might be conscious too, and those could now be observers. And in fact, if you take this to its logical limit, you get something that looks like decoherence model, where everything is a tiny observer observing everything else all the time. So that quantum state, the information is being lost continually into the environment because the environment's continually observing and measuring itself. So yes, I think that consciousness collapses the wave function, but I don't think it's like our consciousness only, right? You have to broaden your definition of consciousness at that point.